Have you ever looked at a person and seen only their uniform? Have you ever measured a soul by the task their hands were performing? We do it without thinking. The person mopping the floor, the one wiping down the table, the one standing quietly in the corner. They become part of the scenery, fixtures in a world that rushes past them, their stories unheard, their potential unseen. But what if we are wrong? What if the most important person in the room is the one no one is looking at? This is a story about what happens when the world is forced to look again. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of Sterling Pharma, a fortress of gleaming glass and steel dedicated to the future of medicine, Elena moved like a ghost. Her official title was custodial technician, a sterile, corporate phrase for a janitor. To the brilliant minds that hurried past her, heads filled with complex molecular structures and clinical trial data, she was less than a ghost. She was simply an obstacle to be sidestepped, a function, not a person. Her gray uniform was a cloak of invisibility. Her cart, with its rattling bottles and worn-out mop, was her constant, silent companion. She kept her head down, the hood of her worn sweatshirt often pulled low, not out of shame, but out of a deep, ingrained need for anonymity. Anonymity was safety. It was a shield against questions she could not answer and a past she fought daily to forget. She would wipe down the glass walls of the laboratories, and on the other side, she would see them, the scientists in their crisp white coats, their faces illuminated by the glow of monitors displaying intricate protein chains. A quiet ache would settle in her chest, a phantom limb of a life that was once hers. Before the war, before the bombs fell, and her world was shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces, she had worn a coat like that. She had been the one deciphering the data, her mind a vibrant landscape of chemical equations and innovative hypotheses. Here, her hands, which once deftly handled micropipettes and calibrated mass spectrometers, now gripped a mop handle, wiping away the footprints of people who were living the life she had lost. But even in this diminished world, her mind did not stop. It couldn't. As she cleaned, she absorbed everything. She saw the subtle changes in the lab protocols, noted the new equipment wheeled in, overheard snippets of conversations about catalytic converters and unstable reagents. She recognized the scent of ozone from an overworked centrifuge and the faint, sweet smell of a specific amino acid compound. The lab wasn't just a place she cleaned, it was a language she understood fluently. She saw the stress in the faces of the research team in Lab 3. They were working on Project Chimera, a revolutionary oncological drug that promised to change everything. Their leader, Dr. Eris Thorne, was a brilliant but volatile man, and the pressure from the top was immense. Elena saw the discarded coffee cups, the half-eaten meals left on desks, the exhaustion etched into their postures. She also saw the small, dangerous mistakes born of that exhaustion, a beaker left too close to a heat source, a volatile chemical cabinet not fully latched. She would quietly fix them. A silent, unthanked guardian of their work. She never said a word. Who would listen to the janitor? To them, her knowledge was as invisible as she was. On this particular night, the air in the building was thick with a unique tension. Mr. Alastair Harrison, the CEO, had been seen stalking the halls, his face a thundercloud. Project Chimera was behind schedule, and the final synthesis of the core compound was failing. Elena could feel the desperation radiating from Lab 3 as she mopped the corridor outside. She finished her work, the rhythmic swish of the mop a familiar, meditative sound in the otherwise silent building. As she pushed her cart toward the service elevator, she glanced back at the lab. Through the reinforced glass, she saw a young researcher, face pale with fatigue, hastily setting up a sequence on the main synthesizer, the heart of the project. She noticed his hands were trembling slightly. She saw him override a standard pressure warning on the console. A knot of cold dread tightened in her stomach. It was a small thing, a shortcut, but with the specific combination of reactants she knew they were using, it was like striking a match in a room full of gas. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the intercom button. What would she say? "Excuse me, I'm the janitor, and you're about to blow up $100 million laboratory." They would laugh. Or worse, they would have her fired for interfering. The weight of her invisibility pressed down on her. She was powerless. She turned away, her heart heavy, and pushed her cart into the elevator. The doors slid shut, and as the elevator began its descent, a deep, deafening roar ripped through the building. The floor beneath her feet buckled, and the lights flickered and died, plunging her into absolute darkness. The explosion was not just a sound, it was a physical blow, a shockwave of shattered glass and twisted metal that echoed the destruction of her past. In the echoing silence that followed, Elena knew two things with chilling certainty. The project was destroyed. And her quiet, invisible life was over. The aftermath was a scene of controlled chaos. Fire alarms shrieked their electronic screams while sprinklers rained down a miserable, sooty water. Emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows down the hallways, illuminating the frantic movements of security guards and the first wave of stunned employees. The heart of the devastation was Lab 3. What was once a pristine environment of scientific promise was now a blackened, smoldering wound in the side of the building. The multi-million-dollar synthesizer was a heap of melted plastic and contorted steel. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt electronics and chemical residue. Mr. Alastair Harrison stood at the edge of the police tape, his face ashen. He wasn't just looking at a destroyed lab, he was looking at the potential collapse of his entire company. Project Chimera was everything. It was their Hail Mary pass, the innovation that was supposed to secure their future against larger, more aggressive competitors. Without it, Sterling Pharma was vulnerable, perhaps even finished. The weight of the board, the shareholders, and the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depended on him pressed down on his shoulders. His legacy was turning to ash before his very eyes. Beside him stood Marcus Thorne, the head of security and operations. Unlike Harrison's visible distress, Marcus was a portrait of cold, calculating composure. He was a man who thrived in crises, not because he was good at solving them, but because he was an expert at navigating the political fallout. He saw opportunity in disaster, a chance to consolidate power and eliminate threats. His eyes, small and sharp, scanned the scene, not with an investigator's curiosity, but with a predator's focus. He needed a narrative, a simple, clean explanation that would assign blame, and more importantly, deflect it from his department. The preliminary fire marshal's report suggested a chemical accelerant, but the initial trigger was unclear. It's negligence, Marcus said, his voice a low, confident hum meant to reassure and direct Harrison's anger. Someone got careless. Someone has to be held accountable, Alastair. The board will demand it. Harrison barely heard him, his mind racing through the catastrophic financial implications. Find out who, he muttered, his voice hoarse. Just find out. That was all the authority Marcus needed. He immediately began his investigation, which was less a search for truth and more a hunt for a plausible scapegoat. He barked orders at his team, his movements sharp and efficient. He knew that the first story told is often the one that sticks, regardless of the facts. He reviewed security logs, cross-referencing personnel access with the time of the explosion. The scientists had all clocked out, except for the one young researcher Elena had seen, who was now in the hospital with minor injuries, swearing the machine had malfunctioned. A machine malfunction would point to a failure in maintenance protocols, which fell under Marcus's purview. That was unacceptable. He needed a human element, an outside factor. And then he saw it. The log showed custodial staff access to that floor. Specifically, Elena's keycard had been used to access the service closet just down the hall minutes before the blast. She was the last person logged on that level who wasn't a researcher. The janitor. She was perfect. She was a ghost, a nobody. She was a refugee with a spotty work history. The file just said she was from a conflict region. Who would question her guilt? Who would advocate for her? Marcus's mind began to spin a story. He dispatched a security team to confiscate her cleaning cart from the basement storage. He walked among the debris in the lab, his eyes scanning for anything he could use. He noticed a faint, unusual residue near the base of the destroyed synthesizer. It didn't match any of the lab's official chemical inventory. It was an anomaly, a loose thread he could weave into a tapestry of blame. He took a sample, his expression grim and purposeful for the benefit of the watching firefighters. He already knew what the analysis would show. It would show whatever he needed it to. In the sterile, white infirmary in the building's basement, Elena was being treated for a mild concussion from the elevator's sudden stop. Her head throbbed, but the pain was nothing compared to the cold fear that was slowly creeping into her veins. She knew what was coming. In her old life, she had seen how quickly blame was assigned after a disaster, how the powerless always paid the price for the mistakes of the powerful. Two security guards, their faces impassive, entered the room. "Mr. Thorne wants to see you," one of them said, his tone leaving no room for argument. They escorted her through the chaotic hallways, past the worried faces of employees who stared at her, then quickly looked away, already absorbing the unspoken narrative. They saw a janitor in a dirty uniform being led by security away from the scene of a catastrophe. The equation was simple. The conclusion, for them, was already drawn. She was led not to an office but to a cold, empty conference room. Marcus Thorne was waiting for her, standing with his arms crossed. On the table in front of him was a plastic evidence bag containing her mop head. The trap had been set. And Elena, the invisible woman, was about to become very, very visible. Marcus began the interrogation not with a question, but with an accusation. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which made it all the more menacing. "We have a problem, Elena," he gestured to the evidence bag on the polished mahogany table that separated them. "We ran a preliminary analysis on the residue found at the blast site. The chemical signature is unusual. It's not something that belongs in a high-tech lab." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air, thick and heavy. Elena stared at the bag. It was her mop. How could her mop be involved? She used standard, company-issued cleaning solutions. She was meticulous, precise. It made no sense. "Then," Marcus continued, his eyes narrowing slightly, "we found the exact same chemical signature on this." He tapped the bag with his finger. "On your mop head. A highly corrosive, non-regulated cleaning agent. The kind of thing someone might bring from home to get a tough stain out, not knowing what it could do if it came into contact with, say, the volatile precursors for an experimental drug." The lie was so audacious, so complete, that Elena felt the air leave her lungs. It was an invention, a fabrication from whole cloth. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain, but the words caught in her throat. Her English, usually careful and deliberate, felt clumsy and inadequate to fight something so monstrous. "I know," she stammered. "I only use the supply closet chemicals." Marcus gave a small, dismissive wave of his hand. "That's not what the evidence says. The evidence says a foreign agent was introduced into the lab environment. It says that agent triggered a catastrophic reaction with the synthesis materials. And it says that agent came from your cleaning cart." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Look, I'm sure it was a mistake. You were tired, you weren't paying attention. But a mistake of this magnitude, people have to be held accountable." The phrase hung in the air, held accountable. It was a corporate euphemism for scapegoat. He was offering her a story, a narrative where she was a tragic, negligent fool. It was a story designed to be simple, believable, and most importantly, to close the case quickly. He pushed a piece of paper and a pen across the table. It was a pre-written statement, a confession of negligence. "Sign this," Marcus said, his voice now hard, all pretense of sympathy gone. "It admits to accidentally using an unauthorized cleaning product. We'll say it was an accident. You'll be fired, of course. But sign it, and the company is less likely to press criminal charges." Criminal charges. The words struck her like a physical blow. The life she had so carefully, so painfully rebuilt was about to be obliterated. She thought of the small apartment she could no longer afford, the money she sent home to a family that had already lost so much. Everything was balanced on this precipice. Her mind, the scientific, analytical mind she kept hidden, screamed at the absurdity. The reaction he described was chemically impossible. The accelerant needed for such a blast would have to be far more potent than any cleaning agent, and the initiation would require a specific energy input, not a casual spill. But how could she explain that? She was the janitor. He was the head of security. Her truth was just noise against his official report. "It is not true," she said, her voice quiet but firm, a small spark of defiance igniting within her. "I did not do this." Marcus's face hardened into a mask of contempt. He had expected tears, a quick confession. He had not expected resistance. "You think anyone will believe you? A refugee with no credentials, no one to vouch for you. Against a full forensic report from my department." He stood up, towering over her. "You are suspended, effective immediately. Don't leave town. You'll be hearing from our lawyers." The guards escorted her to the door. As she walked out, she saw through the glass into the main office area. A crowd of employees was gathered, watching. Their faces were a mixture of fear, anger, and pity. They were watching the janitor who had destroyed the company's future. The story was already told. The lie was already the truth. Elena walked out of the building, not as a ghost, but as a pariah, the weight of a crime she did not commit pressing down on her like a physical shroud. The cold night air hit her, but she barely felt it. She was alone, accused, and stripped of the one thing she had left, her quiet, invisible existence. The following days were a blur of suffocating silence and gnawing anxiety for Elena. Her small apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The suspension meant no pay, and her meager savings were dwindling with terrifying speed. Every knock on the door sent a jolt of panic through her. Every phone call could be the one from the lawyers, or worse, the police. The news reports were relentless. Sterling Pharma's stock had plummeted. News anchors spoke in grave tones about the massive setback, the catastrophic human error that had jeopardized a life-saving drug. They never mentioned her name, referring only to a negligent contract worker, but Elena felt the brand of public guilt as if it were seared onto her skin. She replayed the moments before the explosion over and over in her mind, her analytical brain desperately searching for an answer. The researcher's trembling hands. The overridden pressure warning. It was a catalyst, yes, but was it enough? The explosion she'd heard, the force she'd felt, it was too powerful, too instantaneous for a simple pressure overload. Marcus's story about the cleaning fluid was a farce, a chemical impossibility designed for people who didn't know the difference between sodium hypochlorite and nitroglycerin. But proving it was another matter entirely. Meanwhile, inside the wounded fortress of Sterling Pharma, Alastair Harrison was fighting his own war. He was besieged by angry board members on conference calls, and hounded by investors demanding answers. Marcus Thorne's report was on his desk, a neat, tidy package of blame. It detailed the chemical analysis, the security logs, and the janitor's refusal to cooperate, which was painted as an admission of guilt. It was the simple, clean narrative Harrison had asked for. It gave the board a villain, the insurance company a clause to invoke, and the public a story to consume. But it didn't feel right. A deep, instinctual unease settled in Harrison's gut. He was a businessman, not a scientist, but he had built his empire on understanding risk and reading people. And the janitor, he remembered seeing her. A quiet woman who seemed to melt into the background. He'd never given her a second thought. But something about Marcus's report felt too perfect, too convenient. The blame fell squarely on the most powerless, voiceless person in the entire organization. Driven by this nagging doubt, Harrison pulled up the security footage from the moments before the explosion. He told no one, not even his assistant. He sat alone in his vast, darkened office late one night, the only light coming from the bank of monitors on his wall. He watched the footage from the corridor outside Lab 3. There she was. The janitor, Elena. He watched her push her cart, her movements efficient and weary. He saw her pause, her gaze fixed on the lab. And then he saw what Marcus had either missed or deliberately ignored. It wasn't the vacant stare of a tired cleaner. Her posture changed. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowed in concentration. It was a look of intense, critical analysis. He'd seen that look 1,000 times before, but only on the faces of his top chemists and engineers as they puzzled over a difficult problem. She was not just looking at the lab, she was reading it. Then he rewound the footage from inside the lab. He watched the young researcher, his movements hurried and clumsy with fatigue. He saw him override the warning. Then, just seconds before the main blast, Harrison noticed it. In the corner of the screen, a small, barely perceptible flicker from the main power conduit feeding the synthesizer. It was followed by a brief, intense flare of blue-white light at the base of the machine, a microsecond of incandescence that was instantly consumed by the massive, fiery explosion. It wasn't a chemical bloom starting from a spill. It looked like an electrical surge. It looked like a detonation. It didn't fit Marcus's narrative of a slow, reactive chemical burn. It looked targeted. Precise. Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, the unease in his gut hardening into suspicion. The janitor's analytical stare. The electrical flare. The too-perfect report from a subordinate known for his ruthless ambition. The pieces didn't fit the picture Marcus had painted. They were beginning to form a different picture altogether, one that was far more sinister. He made a decision. It was a long shot, a move his board would call insane if they knew. It went against every corporate protocol. But his instincts, the very instincts that had made him a CEO, were screaming at him. He picked up his phone and called his head of HR. "Find me the personnel file for the janitor from the 3rd floor, he commanded. The one who was suspended. And get me her home address. I need to speak with her." Now the call from Mr. Harrison's office was so unexpected that Elena, at first, assumed it was a cruel joke. The voice on the other end was polite but firm, a secretary requesting her presence at the Sterling Pharma headquarters the next morning. It wasn't a summons from a lawyer, but from the king himself. Fear and a tiny, flickering ember of hope warred within her. Why would the CEO want to see her? Was it to personally fire her? To intimidate her into signing the confession? Or was it something else? The next morning, she walked through the gleaming lobby of the building where she had once been invisible. This time, however, everyone saw her. The receptionist looked up with wide, curious eyes. Employees whispered as she was escorted to the executive elevator. She was no longer a ghost, she was the infamous janitor, the woman at the center of the storm. Mr. Harrison's office was on the top floor, a vast space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city, a world away from the service closets and boiler rooms she knew. Alastair Harrison was standing by the window, his back to her. He looked tired, the weight of his company visible in the slump of his shoulders. Marcus Thorne was there, too, standing near the desk like a loyal guard dog, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He clearly believed this meeting was to finalize Elena's fate. "Thank you for coming," Harrison said, turning to face her. His eyes were tired but sharp, and they held none of the contempt she had expected. They held a flicker of curiosity. "Mr. Thorne has presented me with a comprehensive report on the incident. It paints a very clear picture," Marcus smirked, shifting his weight. "As I said, Alastair, it was a tragic but straightforward case of negligence." Harrison ignored him. His gaze remained fixed on Elena. He gestured to a large monitor on the wall. "I've been reviewing the security footage," he said, his voice even. "I'd like you to watch it with me." He played the clip from the hallway. He played her pause, her analytical stare. "Tell me what you were thinking," Harrison said, his voice quiet. "Right here. What did you see?" The question was so direct, so unexpected, that it broke through Elena's fear. He wasn't accusing her. He was asking her. Marcus stepped forward, ready to protest. "Alastair, what is the point of this?" "She's just going to lie." Harrison held up a hand, silencing him without looking at him. "Please," he said to Elena. "Tell me." For the first time in years, someone in a position of power was asking for her thoughts, not her labor. A dam of silence and suppression inside her began to crack. She took a deep breath. "I saw a mistake," she began, her voice hesitant at first, then gaining strength as the familiar language of science returned to her. The researcher inside, he was tired. He initiated the final synthesis phase, but he overrode the system's pressure equalization warning. The reagents they were using, the specific isomers for Project Chimera, they are highly sensitive to atmospheric pressure fluctuations. Overriding that protocol could create a volatile reaction, Marcus scoffed. See? She's admitting he was negligent. It was his fault. No, Elena said, turning to face him, her eyes flashing with an intensity that stunned both men. It would not cause an explosion like that. A pressure imbalance would cause a rupture, a chemical fire perhaps. A violent outgassing. But the blast, the concussive force, that required a rapid, high-energy initiation. It was not a reaction. It was a detonation. She walked past the stunned Marcus and stood before the monitor, her body language transforming. The timid, stooped janitor vanished, replaced by an erect, confident professional. She was no longer in a conference room, she was in her element. Show me the internal footage again, she commanded, her tone so authoritative that Harrison clicked the mouse without a second thought. There, she said, pointing a steady finger at the screen as he replayed the moment of the blast in slow motion. That blue-white flare at the power conduit. That is not a chemical fire. That is an electrical arc. A massive one. The energy signature of a short-circuited, high-amperage current. The explosion did not start in the reaction chamber. It started at the power source. She turned away from the screen to face Harrison directly. The words poured out of her, a torrent of scientific reasoning that had been dammed up for years. Mr. Thorne's theory of a cleaning agent causing the blast is, forgive me, it is absurd. No household or industrial cleaning chemical has the reactive potential to cause that level of destruction. The activation energy would be immense. What he found was a red herring, a plant. Something to create a convenient story. This was not an accident. It was sabotage. The synthesizer was deliberately destroyed with an electrically initiated explosive device placed at the base of the primary power conduit. It was designed to look like a lab accident, but it was, without a doubt, an act of demolition. The room was silent. Harrison stared at her, his expression one of utter astonishment. He was not looking at a janitor. He was looking at a brilliant scientist. Marcus Thorne's face was pale, his smug confidence replaced by a dawning horror. He had chosen the perfect scapegoat, but he had made one fatal miscalculation. He had never imagined that she could fight back with the one weapon he couldn't counter, the truth. Who are you? Harrison finally whispered, the question filled with awe. Elena's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of her past returning. My name is Dr. Elena Vance, she said softly. Before the war, I was a senior chemical engineer at the Kirov Institute. My specialization was advanced molecular synthesis and energetic materials. The revelation landed with the force of a second explosion in the silent office. Marcus Thorne looked as though he'd been struck by lightning, his face a ghastly shade of white. He had built his case on the assumption that Elena was an ignorant, powerless nobody. He had just discovered his quiet little mouse was, in fact, a lion. Alastair Harrison, however, felt a surge of adrenaline, a thrill of discovery that cut through his despair. His instincts had been right. He had found not a culprit but an expert, hidden in plain sight. This woman didn't just know what had happened, she was uniquely qualified to prove it. Marcus, Harrison said, his voice dangerously calm, his eyes never leaving Elena. You are to grant Dr. Vance full access to the wreckage of Lab 3. Provide her with any equipment she requires. Give her a security pass that opens every door in this building. She is no longer a suspect. She is now the lead consultant on this investigation, Marcus sputtered, his composure shattering. Alastair, you can't be serious. She's the prime suspect. This is insane. She's manipulating you. The only thing I find insane, Marcus, Harrison replied, his voice dropping to an icy whisper, is that a mind like this has been spent mopping our floors. You will do as I say, or you will be cleaning out your desk by lunchtime. Is that clear? Marcus paled further, a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. He gave a curt, resentful nod. Harrison turned back to Elena, his expression one of profound respect and something akin to apology. "Dr. Vance," he said, the title feeling right on his tongue. "Will you help us? Will you find out who did this?" Elena looked at the man who had, in the space of 10 minutes, seen past her uniform and given her back a name she thought was lost forever. The ember of hope within her roared into a flame. "Yes, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will." The walk to Lab 3 was a surreal experience for Elena. This time, she wasn't pushing a mop cart, she was striding beside the CEO, flanked by a resentful-looking Marcus Thorne who was forced to swipe his master keycard to grant them access. The scientists and engineers who had once looked through her now stared at her with a mixture of confusion and awe. The rumor mill was churning at full speed. The janitor, the one they all believed was guilty, was now walking the halls like a queen, and the head of security looked like a man being led to his own execution. The lab was even worse than she had imagined. The acrid smell still hung heavy in the air. The space was a mangled graveyard of scientific ambition, cordoned off with yellow tape. Elena stood at the edge of the wreckage, her mind already working, sifting through the chaos, imposing order on the destruction. "I need a full forensics kit," she said, her voice echoing in the ruined space. A portable mass spectrometer, gas chromatograph, and access to the building's full chemical inventory logs for the past 6 months, she turned to a stunned-looking senior researcher who had been called to the scene. "And you," she said, her tone professional and direct, "I need you to be my hands. I will tell you what to look for." The researcher, a man named Dr. Peters who had never once made eye contact with her when she cleaned his office, now nodded eagerly. "Of course, Dr. Vance." The name still sounded foreign on their tongues. Marcus Thorne watched from the doorway, his arms crossed, his face a thunderous mask of impotent rage. He made a show of speaking into his radio, ordering his guards to keep a close eye on the consultant, a pathetic attempt to reassert his authority. But everyone in the room knew the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Elena ignored him completely. She was home. For the next several hours, she orchestrated the investigation with a precision and focus that left everyone breathless. She directed Dr. Peters through the debris, her instructions clear and concise. "Check the charring patterns on the support struts. Look for asymmetrical heat distribution. That will give us the blast's point of origin. Take samples from the ceiling tiles directly above the synthesizer. We're looking for vaporized metallic deposits. The composition will tell us what part of the machine failed first." She moved with a purpose they had never seen, her eyes scanning every detail, her mind connecting patterns none of them had noticed. She was no longer Elena the janitor. She was Dr. Vance, a formidable scientist in her element. Marcus's attempts to obstruct were subtle but constant. He would question her methodology in front of Dr. Peters, trying to sow doubt. "Are you sure that's a standard procedure?" "In my experience." He would begin, only to be cut off by Elena's sharp, fact-based retorts. "Your experience is in security, Mr. Thorne. Mine is in thermodynamics. The evidence will not be found in your procedural manual." Each time, he was left looking foolish, his authority shrinking with every passing minute. Dr. Peters, initially skeptical, was quickly won over, his respect for Elena growing with each brilliant deduction she made. He became her eager apprentice, marveling at her ability to reconstruct the event from the smallest clues. Finally, late in the afternoon, came the breakthrough. Guided by Elena's analysis of the blast pattern, Dr. Peters was carefully clearing debris near the base of the mangled power conduit. "Dr. Vance," he called out, his voice tense with excitement. "You need to see this." Elena knelt beside him. Tucked into a crevice of twisted metal, something that had been shielded from the main force of the blast, was a tiny, partially melted fragment of green plastic and copper wiring. It was no bigger than a thumbnail. To an untrained eye, it was just another piece of wreckage. But Elena knew immediately what she was looking for. "Get the portable microscope," she ordered. Under magnification, the fragment revealed its secrets. It was a piece of a circuit board. But it wasn't from the synthesizer. The design was wrong, the components non-standard for this type of industrial machinery. It was sophisticated, compact, and bore the faint, heat-warped logo of a military-grade electronics manufacturer. It was a piece of a high-frequency digital timer. "It's the detonator," Elena whispered, a grim satisfaction in her voice. "This is our proof," but she wasn't done. She took a swab from the metal around the fragment and ran it through the portable mass spectrometer. As the machine whirred and processed the data, a graph appeared on the small screen. Elena's eyes narrowed. Alongside the expected steel and copper alloys, there was a spike. A clear, unmistakable signature of RDX and aluminum powder. A thermobaric accelerant. It wasn't just an explosion, she declared to the small, captivated audience of Harrison, Peters, and a fuming Marcus. It was a small, precisely placed shaped charge. The timer triggered an electrical surge which ignited the accelerant, focusing the blast directly into the synthesizer's core components. The goal wasn't just to cause a fire, it was to completely vaporize the machine's prototype heart, leaving nothing salvageable. This was the work of a professional. The scientific case was now closed. The what and the how were answered. But the most important question remained: who? Elena looked up from the evidence, her gaze sweeping past Harrison and landing squarely on Marcus Thorne. The sabotage was professional, but the cover-up, the planted evidence on her mop, the fabricated chemical report, was amateurish and desperate. It was the act of a man in over his head, trying to control a narrative that was spiraling away from him. The bomber had an accomplice on the inside. Someone with the authority to doctor reports, plant evidence, and most importantly, bypass security to allow the saboteur access to the lab in the first place. The investigation pivoted from forensic science to human intelligence. In his office, with Elena now seated at his conference table like a trusted advisor, Alastair Harrison began to pull on the threads she had uncovered. A professional job means this wasn't an act of random vandalism or employee discontent, Harrison strategized, his mind now sharp and focused. This was corporate espionage. Someone wanted Project Chimera destroyed, and they wanted it done permanently. His eyes met Elena's. Biocorp, they both said at the same time. Biocorp was Sterling Pharma's most ruthless competitor. They had been working on a similar drug but were years behind in development. The success of Project Chimera would have effectively shut down their entire oncology division, costing them billions. The motive was clear and overwhelming. If Biocorp hired a professional, Elena reasoned, that professional would need access. They would need someone on the inside to disable alarms, manipulate security logs, and create a window of opportunity. Harrison's jaw tightened. Someone like the head of security and operations. The focus of the investigation turned squarely onto Marcus Thorne. Harrison, using his executive authority, initiated a deep background and financial audit on Marcus, bypassing all normal channels. He brought in a trusted forensic accountant, a woman who worked directly for him, and no one else. While the accountant dug into Marcus's life, Elena turned her attention to the building's digital infrastructure. With her new top-level clearance, she delved into the security logs, not just the surface-level reports Marcus had shown Harrison, but the raw, unalterable data from the servers. It took her hours cross-referencing terabytes of data, but her mind, accustomed to finding signals in the noise of complex datasets, was perfectly suited for the task. She found it deep in the server archives. A single, erased entry from the night of the explosion. The main system log showed no one entering Lab 3 after the research team left. But the server's core audit trail, a separate, tamper-proof system, told a different story. It showed a maintenance override being activated on the lab's electronic lock at 2:17 a.m., and the override code used was a master key, one of only 3 in the entire company. One belonged to Harrison. One to the head of R&D. And the third belonged to Marcus Thorne. The log then showed an unauthorized keycard, listed only as Visitor 7 accessing the lab. 10 minutes later, the connection to the lab's internal sensors went dead. 30 minutes after that, the explosion rocked the building. There was no record of Visitor 7 ever leaving. As Elena uncovered the digital ghost, the forensic accountant walked into Harrison's office, her face grim. "I've found it," she said, placing a folder on the desk. "Marcus Thorne has significant gambling debts. Over the last 6 months, he's been making large cash deposits into his bank account. Last week, a single wire transfer for $250,000 appeared. It was routed through 3 offshore shell corporations, but I traced the origin point. The money came from a holding company. A holding company owned by Biocorp." The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place, forming a dark and damning picture. Marcus, desperate and in debt, had been the inside man. He had taken Biocorp's money, used his authority to let a saboteur into the lab, and then, when the explosion occurred, he had framed the first person he could think of, the invisible janitor he assumed would be the perfect, silent scapegoat. He had no idea that the brilliant mind he tried to frame was the very person capable of exposing him. Harrison leaned back in his chair, a cold fury in his eyes. He looked at Elena, the woman Marcus had tried to destroy, the woman who had just saved his company. "It's time to end this," he said. He called for an emergency meeting of the executive board. And he told his assistant to make sure Marcus Thorne was in attendance. The boardroom at Sterling Pharma was a place of immense power, a sanctum of polished wood and hushed tones where fates were decided. When Marcus Thorne entered, he felt a surge of his old confidence. He saw the grim faces of the board members and assumed Harrison had called them together to finally put the janitor incident to rest and announce his own competent handling of the crisis. He took his seat, arranging his papers, ready to perform. Alastair Harrison sat at the head of the table, his face unreadable. He waited until the doors were closed before he spoke. "We are here to discuss the conclusion of the investigation into the Lab 3 explosion," he began, his voice ringing with authority. Marcus straightened his tie, a small, self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. But his smile faded when the door opened again, and Dr. Elena Vance walked in. She was not wearing her janitor's uniform, or her own simple clothes. Harrison's assistant had provided her with a professional suit. She looked poised, confident, every inch the brilliant scientist she was. She took a seat beside Harrison, placing a laptop on the table. The board members murmured in confusion, looking from the disgraced janitor to Marcus, who was now staring at Elena as if he'd seen a ghost. "Before we review the final report," Harrison continued, "our lead consultant, Dr. Vance, has a presentation to make." He nodded to Elena. This was her moment. All the years of being silenced, of being overlooked, of hiding her brilliance behind a mop and a bucket, it all led to this. She stood up, her back straight, and her voice, when she spoke, was not the hesitant, accented English of a frightened refugee, but the clear, precise cadence of an expert in her field. "Good morning," she began, her eyes sweeping across the stunned faces of the board. "For the past day, I have been conducting a forensic analysis of the Lab 3 incident. What I have found is not a case of negligence, but a targeted and sophisticated act of industrial sabotage." For the next 20 minutes, she held the room captive. She presented the science with breathtaking clarity, displaying magnified images of the timer fragment, the mass spectrometer's readings of the accelerant, and 3D models of the blast trajectory. She dismantled Marcus's fabricated story piece by piece, not with anger but with cold, irrefutable scientific fact. She exposed his chemical report as a fiction, explaining the thermodynamic impossibility of his claims. The room was silent, captivated by the sheer force of her intellect. Marcus began to sweat. He tried to interrupt, to object. "This is absurd. She's a janitor. She has no qualifications. This is all just a wild theory." "Her qualifications," Harrison cut in, his voice like steel, "include a doctorate in chemical engineering, and a prior position as a senior scientist at one of Eastern Europe's most prestigious research institutes. Her theory is about to be substantiated." Elena then projected the server logs onto the main screen. She showed the board the ghost entry, the maintenance override, the use of Marcus's master code, the appearance of the mysterious Visitor 7. She laid out the timeline, minute by damning minute. The saboteur did not stumble into our lab, Elena stated, her gaze locking onto Marcus. They were let in by someone with the highest level of security clearance, as if on cue. Harrison slid a file down the polished table. It stopped directly in front of Marcus. That, Harrison said to the board, is Mr. Thorne's financial review. It shows a series of large, unexplained cash deposits coinciding with Project Chimera's development hurdles. It culminates in a $250,000 payment received last week from a shell corporation owned by our competitor, BioCorp. Every eye in the room turned to Marcus. His face, which had gone from smug to pale to ashen, now crumpled in on itself. The weight of the evidence, the scientific and the financial, was crushing him. He was trapped, exposed, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. I was in debt, he stammered, the confession tumbling out of him, a pathetic torrent of excuses. They contacted me, said it would be a small thing. Just a little fire, enough to set the project back. I never knew they would use an explosive. When it happened, I panicked. I had to find someone to blame. His eyes darted to Elena, a pathetic mix of anger and pleading. She was perfect. No one would ever listen to her. She was nobody. The silence that followed his outburst was deafening. He had not only confessed to the crime, but had laid bare the ugly prejudice at its heart. He had seen a uniform, not a person. He had seen a refugee, not a scientist. He had seen a nobody, and in doing so, had engineered his own downfall. Harrison stood up. Security, he said into the room's intercom. The doors opened and 2 guards entered, the same 2 who had escorted Elena out of the building days earlier. This time, they walked to Marcus Thorne. They stood behind his chair. His pathetic, blubbering confession was his final act at Sterling Pharma. The man who had wielded his power with such casual cruelty was now powerless, his career and freedom evaporating before his eyes. As they led him away, Alastair Harrison looked at Elena, his expression a mixture of gratitude and profound shame for his own blindness. The company had been saved, not by its highly paid executives or its star scientists, but by the quiet, invisible woman who cleaned their floors, the brilliant mind they had almost thrown away. The resolution was swift and decisive. Marcus Thorne was arrested, and his confession implicated several key executives at BioCorp, leading to a massive corporate espionage scandal that rocked the industry. The news, which could have sunk Sterling Pharma, was instead framed as a story of resilience and hidden genius. The story of the brilliant refugee janitor who uncovered the plot became a media sensation, and Sterling's stock, once in freefall, rebounded stronger than ever. In the wake of the scandal, Alastair Harrison did something unprecedented. He called an all-hands meeting for the entire company. He stood before his hundreds of employees, not to celebrate the victory, but to deliver a heartfelt apology. He publicly apologized to Elena, who stood beside him on the stage, for the company's collective failure. We pride ourselves on being a company that looks to the future, that sees what others cannot, Harrison said, his voice filled with emotion. But we failed to see the talent that was right here among us, hidden by a uniform and our own careless assumptions. We almost destroyed the very person who would save us. That is a failure of my leadership, and it will not happen again. He then officially offered Dr. Elena Vance the position of Director of Research and Development for the new Project Chimera initiative, with a salary and resources that reflected her immense value. He announced the creation of the Vance program, a company-wide initiative to identify and nurture hidden talent at every level of the organization, ensuring no one would ever be invisible at Sterling Pharma again. Elena, overwhelmed but resolute, accepted the position. The transition was staggering. One week, she was wearing a gray janitor's smock, the next, she was in a pristine white lab coat, not just working in the lab but running it. There were moments of awkwardness, scientists who once ignored her now fumbling to treat her as their boss. But her quiet confidence and undeniable brilliance quickly earned their respect. She didn't just rebuild the synthesizer, she redesigned it from the ground up, implementing innovative solutions that made it more stable and 20% more efficient. She saw flaws in the original design that the previous team, in their haste and exhaustion, had missed. Under her leadership, the project that had been set back months was now accelerating at an incredible pace. With her first paycheck, a sum of money larger than any she had ever seen, she began the process of bringing her family, who were still in a refugee camp, to join her. She bought a small, comfortable house, a world away from her tiny, cramped apartment. She was not just rebuilding her career, she was rebuilding her life. Months later, Alastair Harrison stood outside the new, state-of-the-art Lab 3, watching Elena through the glass. She was at a whiteboard, surrounded by her team of scientists, her face alive with passion as she sketched out a complex chemical equation. She was laughing, her team was engaged, and the energy in the room was electric. They were on the verge of a breakthrough, the one that would change medicine forever. He had almost lost everything because he, like everyone else, had looked but had not seen. Elena had not only saved his company, she had transformed it, and him along with it. His perspective was forever altered. He no longer saw job titles or uniforms, he saw people, each with a story, each with a universe of potential hidden within. He had learned the most valuable lesson of his career, that true genius doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits patiently in the quiet corners, waiting for just one person to be willing to look. So I ask you again, who are the invisible people in your world? The ones you walk past every day without a second thought. The most brilliant minds can be found in the most unexpected places. The most valuable person in the room might be the one no one is talking to. The next time you walk through your office, your school, or your city, I want you to do something. Look again. Really look. See the person, not the function. Acknowledge the humanity in their eyes. You never know what hidden genius, what quiet hero, you might be ignoring. Their story could change your world, just as Elena's changed hers. Share this story with someone you know. Remind them that every single person has a story worth knowing, and a potential worth seeing. You might just uncover the brilliance that's been there all along.